Hello, this is Mike from Urban Legends and Mythology, and that sound means I just cracked open a delicious Voodoo Tropical Force IPA. And today I'm going to do this episode a little differently. I'm not going to refer to any notes, I haven't prepared anything for this, no scripts. No bullet points, no anything. I'm just going to kind of keep it loose today. And the reason for that today is we're not diving into any specific urban legend or myth or ghostly tale or any of that this time around. This time around, in celebration of the upcoming holiday, 4th of July, I'm going to discuss something that everybody knows but doesn't really understand, and it's that whole kind of concept of Americanism, what it means to be an American. Because on the world stage, we do stand out as a very unique culture. We're not bound by certain ethnicities or geography or languages or religions. We're basically a series of all that thrown together and dumped on this continent. And hell, the only thing that really binds us together is national identity and our Constitution. Other than that, there's really nothing that binds one American to another outside of familial relationships or certain cultural views. For example, what it means to be an American for somebody like me living here in Ohio is vastly different than what it means to be an American according to someone who spent their entire lives in New York or Texas or Los Angeles or Nevada. But there are a few American things that kind of transcend that and makes us such a weird, unique, crazy culture. But I am less than 2 minutes into this and I'm already all over the place. So let's go back season 1 style and start at the beginning. Now, I'm not going to go all the way back into pre-European contact because the concept of an American didn't exist then. The whole concept of what it means to be an American doesn't really become a thing until around the time of the Rev War. And we all know the American Revolution, taxes and tea, and hey France, can you help us out, even though it will bankrupt you and send you into your own revolution. And it all leads to the initial myth of hell, the nation's founding. Because any nation that is birthed in war is going to see its foundation heavily mythologized, just like ours was. Because to Americans, at that point, any previous history that happened on the American continent was over. And the founding fathers, the creators of this new republic, would become mythological figures over time, even though we know they existed. We have historic accounts that they exist. But subsequent generations, and we're talking what? 8, 9 generations down the road now, possibly a little more. These figures are almost mythologized at this point. I mean, hell, we look at somebody like George Washington in the same manner that somebody living during the Pax Romana would have looked back at like Caesar Augustus. And if you look at our foundation myth, if you read the story of the Revolutionary War and how it all came to be, it reads like an adventure story. You essentially have these underdogs who are oppressed by this system, which treats them as second-class citizens, taxes them unjustly. At one point, they shut down Boston Harbor, which was at the time the most prosperous harbor in North America. These ragtag rebels, they eventually fight back and they organize and fight in this brutal civil war to expel their overlords and establish this new shining republic. You have heroes and villains and spies and turncoats. Hell, to give it a good analogy, just look at Star Wars. It's kind of like that, but without magical space wizards. But our entire foundation myth is an epic tale of heroism, a shining new nation built from the ashes of the fiery chaos of the old world, a blank slate, a fresh start. And this tale is one of the first stories American children hear in school, in history classes. And early on, they hear that idealized version. It's not until later, when the ones who are actually interested in the real history of what happened realize that it's heavily mythologized and these people were flawed and blah blah blah. I can go on all day about that. However, for a vast majority of Americans, the fairy tale they hear in those first kind of early years of development is good enough. And they kind of carry that with them throughout their whole lives, even if they don't know all the facts or details of the story. For the average American, in their minds, history starts in 1776. Now, I'm not going to get into how that infuriates me sometimes, but to each his own. Also, I know I'm 5 minutes into this, but as a disclaimer, a lot of this is going to be my own personal opinion, and my opinion is not mainstream. It's not politically mainstream, it's not religiously mainstream. Hell, it's not even really historically mainstream, because the history makers, those who write the history books, they want to keep that kind of mythologized ideology alive. There's a financial incentive for them to do that so they can sell more history books. But as always on this show, although I do let my personal biases slip in sometimes, I do try to look at everything from a pragmatic, kind of neutral stance. I'm never out to attack one side or the other. I'm just here to kind of find the truth behind the mystery. And as we know, when it comes to stories, and there's always two sides, the real truth lies somewhere in the middle. And I like to cut away all the flack in order to root out that truth. I guess at the end of the day, I just believe in the art of compromise, which is something that's lost in our current political landscape, but I digress. So back to the idea of Americanism, we really see it become a thing during that kind of first generation after the Rev War. It really starts to come out with the ideology of the self-made man, manifest destiny, seeking out these new lands and adventures. Kind of that Jacksonian era mindset. And that's what really encouraged people to keep pushing westward. And it's kind of the reason why Americans left Europe and other parts of the world in the first place, to seek out new opportunities in these new lands. So let's skip back in time a little bit real quick. So I always make the joke that the United States of America is made up of Europe's rejects. Now, what do I mean by that? So what was the driving force that forced people to want to come to America in the first place? New opportunities, new trade routes, new adventures that could be had in this, quote, new world. To the average guy sitting in Ireland in 1649, there was nothing there for him. Not when you're like an average farmer in a broken system, dealing with local lords and kings, and there's no social mobility. However, hearing tales that there's a whole new continent across the ocean, 2 continents actually, that you can go there and make your fortunes in and live the way you want without anybody telling you what to do. And you don't have to be bound by religious or social birth status or anything like that. You can just be free. That was very enticing. It was enticing enough to like my, 8th or 9th great grandfather, because that's the year when he arrived in Virginia as an indentured servant. He indentured himself to like some guy to pay for his journey over here, worked on his farm for several years, and then after he basically paid that off, he was free to do his own thing, and my family has been in America ever since. But to be honest, we didn't go very far. We pretty much stayed in West Virginia, Kentucky, and I was the first generation born in Ohio, so I guess what that states is we don't have much of a sense of adventure or travel in my family. But what I'm getting at is they brought that idea with them that they're in the new world now and their children can keep seeking out these new lands and go further and do better. And by the Jacksonian era, under this shining new republic that's no longer indentured to a parliament in Europe and a king, that really manifests in their mindset that, hey, this could all be ours, obviously if we commit genocide against the Native Americans. But essentially, we are free to do whatever we want. We can seek our fortunes, and nobody can tell us not to. There's this idea that I can keep traveling west and get some land and build a farm and have a house and live free. Nobody will bother me. Or I can go to a major city and insert business idea here, because there's nothing to stop me. That rigid idea of the old world and classism no longer exists. At least for the most part, classism was kind of always there because you always have wealthy dickbags who just run everything. But those ideas are really set in motion during this period. And it just snowballs from there. And it really starts to manifest that idea of individualism, which is something I believe in. For example, as an American, I believe that it's my right to basically live my life the way I want to live it and screw anybody who thinks otherwise. It's kind of why I identify with the anarchist movement. It's the idea of leave me alone, stay out of my business. Now, I'm not saying that anarchism is the solution to everything. I do believe that a state has to exist in order to provide for those who can't provide for themselves. But in American culture, generally speaking, our mindset is an individualist mindset. For example, the boomer generation is really a extreme version of that mentality. Their whole mentality, their whole mindset is, well, I got mine, so screw you. And that mindset is the source of a lot of current problems, but fortunately my generation is starting to reverse that. However, the individualism still stands because it's as American as baseball and apple pie. But that kind of mindset, that mentality, it does kind of ebb and flow with each generation, because when it comes to the parents of the boomers, the silents and the greatest generation who fought in World War II in Korea, that mentality is diametrically opposed to that. It's more collective. It's, hey, we're all in this together. Let's sacrifice a little bit of our individuality in order to, go liberate Europe from the Nazis or defeat communism. However, that undercurrent of individualism is still there, because when they won World War II, for example, they came back and, okay, I'm going to get myself a small house, I'm going to raise a family, I'm going to have a job, I'm going to do what's good for me. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of on a generational cycle. However, there's always the undercurrent of individualism there. For example, my generation, millennials, we do have this kind of collective attitude that we saw amongst the greatest generation. That same attitude of, hey, let's come together again to solve some of our nation's problems. Hyper-individualism's going a little too far and it's damaging our country. But I guess all that shows is Americans, we do have the ability to come together and unite when we spot specific threats. Because politically, religiously, whatever, we can oppose each other all day. But when something attacks us as a whole, for example, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 9/11 attack, we instantly just kind of drop everything and we just focus on that. And that harkens back to this extreme nationalistic attitude we have as a culture. And it's kind of a funny phenomena. It's kind of like when you have siblings. When you're young, you bicker and fight with your siblings all day long. But the moment an outsider comes along and tries to pick a fight with your little brother or sister, we all unite against that outsider, because it's like, yeah, I can beat them up, but you can't. And that nationalistic attitude is kind of ingrained in Americans from almost birth, and then it's nurtured throughout our lives. Especially when every day in our media we're told we're number one, we're the best. Everywhere we go, we see an American flag somewhere. I mean, hell, I'm going to dinner in a couple hours, and I guarantee you I'll see at least 15 American flags during that commute. It's something that never goes away. It's always with us, and it harkens back to that creation myth that we had of our revolution. It taps into our inherent patriotism. That's why politics are such a madhouse here in the United States. It looks hyper-individualistic, but at the end of the day, it's really at its core nationalist, no matter what side you're on, because as I said earlier, especially when it comes to politics are a national thing. We want to guide the nation that we live in a certain way. And current interest in politics in the US is, from what I see, at an all-time high, at least in my lifetime. But there's a central core of nationalism there, because our political beliefs are a reflection of how we want our country to be, because we care about our country. Now, a lot of people are kind of blind to that. They just focus on certain issues or platforms or whatever. They say, I don't care about America per se, I care about X. And I think we need to pass laws in the state legislatures in order to pass insert platform here. But at the core of that, you're doing that because you believe in nationalism. You're doing that because you believe that's what's best for the country as a whole. It's so ingrained into our culture that we are basically blind to it. But now I'm off on kind of a philosophical kind of rant. Let's kind of hone it back in and discuss some other things that are quintessentially American. So let's shift it in a more fun direction. Let's talk about, I don't know, football, monster trucks, cheeseburgers, theme parks, mega stores, Hollywood, our media, McDonald's, war, guns, explosions, extremism, and all the other stuff that makes an American an American. So one thing that really makes America stand out on the world stage is we are a land of extremes, and we do have an extremely high quality of living, despite the fact that we have the worst healthcare of any developed nation, but I digress. But our standard of living really does far exceed most other nations. Like myself, for example, I'm considered working class or working poor. However, I have a much better and higher quality of living than, let's say, somebody in Argentina, for example, who would also be considered in that same social class, working class or poor. But my life here in the United States is so good that I can afford to have, for example, this apartment on the nice side of town. I can afford to have this podcast as a hobby. I don't have to work 12 or 15 hours a day just to make ends meet. And that affords Americans certain luxuries and problems that just don't exist in other nations. However, with that, we do become somewhat spoiled. We're spoiled by our media. We're spoiled by the abundance that we have. We're spoiled by cheap goods and endless access to trade and resources. We're spoiled by, our companies exploiting cheap labor overseas so we can continue to buy, bigger TVs. It kind of reminds me of years ago, back in 2005, 2006, I'm not quite sure of the year, it was almost 20 years ago. But I had this friend from Slovakia, and she was a foreign exchange student. We were driving around in my old 1995 Pontiac, and I was complaining about the price of gasoline. It was going for $3.45 a gallon or something like that. And she turned to me and she said, "You Americans are so fucking spoiled. You have no idea." She was like, back home, the price of gasoline is the equivalent of like $8 or $9 a gallon, and driving is a very expensive kind of thing to get into. It costs a lot of money to get a driver's license, let alone a car. And that was an instance that really opened my eyes up early on in my early adult years, where I was like, yeah, maybe we are kind of spoiled here in the United States. Of course, subsequently, I started kind of looking into that subject and realized that car culture is really a thing that's unique to the United States. And that kind of makes sense because car culture is really ingrained in our American DNA. I remember being 15, 16 years old in the early 2000s. This would have been like 2002, 2003. And one of the main things on my mind is, yeah, I want to get my license and I want to get a car. Because in America, we drive everywhere. Getting your driver's license and getting your first car, that's like a rite of passage into adulthood. And it's considered that point where we truly have the freedom to go wherever we want, or pretty much wherever we want. I'm pretty sure I can't drive up to the gates of Area 51 and be let in, but I don't know, who wants to take a road trip? I wouldn't mind meeting the guys who kind of skulk around that area in the white trucks with all the camo fatigues with all the patches torn off. But I think that's a teaser for an upcoming episode. Did you know there was a guy that actually successfully snuck into Area 51 in like the late 90s and spent like 3 days there undetected? True story. I'll get to that sometime later this season. But car culture really is the definitive American thing. It's the ultimate source of freedom to an American. Because first off, we get a car and it's ours. We want our car, we want it to be a specific car, and we want to customize it and, just make it our own. I mean, my first car was that old 95 Pontiac GT, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world until I got that 92 Camaro RS a couple of years later. Ended up totaling the Pontiac, but that's a story for another day. But like I said, it's the ultimate source of freedom, and that harkens back over 100 years now, because that was the whole point of Henry Ford and his assembly line and his mass production of the Model T, which became the basic standard car in America throughout the teens and 20s. The mass production of these vehicles made them so cheap that even his own workers could buy them, and they could travel all over the United States, even though our road infrastructure was barely existent at the time. But the United States, and I'm talking about the lower 48, I'm excluding Alaska and Hawaii in this for obvious reasons, it's an extremely vast land. I don't think people quite understand just how large the US is. It is massive. It's roughly 3,000 miles end to end. It's much bigger than Europe. For example, I can drive for 4 hours in the state of Ohio and still be in Ohio. Meanwhile, somebody in Europe can drive 4 hours and go through like 2 or 3 different countries depending on where they're at. So you're pretty much required to have a car if you literally want to go anywhere, because our public transportation infrastructure is barely existent anymore. Now, I will admit, in the 19th century and even up until about the 1950s, we did have a significant rail system in the United States. But when we created the interstate system here in the US, things like rail and public transportation started to take a back seat. That's why passenger rail here in the United States really isn't a thing anymore. There are some places that are still doing it. However, most of the rail now here in the United States is sequestered towards trade. It's actually to the point where like freight trains, so trains that are carrying, I don't know, coal or iron ore or whatever, they have precedence on rail lines. Rail lines are dedicated specifically to them. But the shift really comes post-World War II in that like 1950s economic boom. We saw a little bit of it in the 20s before the Great Depression really slapped America pretty hard. But it's in the late 40s and early 50s when we really started to see car culture blossom. And it blossomed with the boomer generation, so the teenagers who were growing up in the 1950s and 1960s. This was America's golden age. It was our nation at its zenith until the 1990s came around. But this was a time when American teenagers were finally getting their first cars. They were usually buying old junkers and fixing them up. And we saw that rise in hot rod culture. So you get this group of teenagers, they'd go to like a junkyard, they'd pull out this 20-year-old car and they'd rebuild it. Because to be honest, what the hell else were you going to do in the 1950s for fun? It's not like they could waste hours scrolling on Facebook or Instagram. But it's really a result of the economic and industrial powerhouse that America has always been. We can make cheap goods, and we can make goods that can be fixed and repurposed and used over and over again. And at this time, 1950s, early 60s, everybody wanted a car, everybody needed a car. For example, Ohio was actually the first state to complete its interstate system of roads because we're such a massive trade hub. Most of the traffic from the Midwest going up to New England comes through Ohio, specifically Columbus. So we started modifying our cities around that concept, that structure of the freeway system, the interstate system. Now I can get in a car and travel all the way to Oregon. I can travel all the way to New York. I can go wherever the hell I want in the matter of hours or just a couple of days. I can get in my car right now and be in Los Angeles in 3 days if I had the desire to ever go there. And a lot of people will be like, well, why wouldn't you take a plane? It's like, fuck planes. I'm an American. I have a car. I'm going to go. I'm going to listen to music I want to listen to. And I'm going to have fun the whole way and stop at random weird roadside attractions. Why not? But even our car culture, it all comes back to that individualism, that freedom that I was talking about earlier. And yes, there are car cultures all over the world. I mean, look at Germany. They build some of the greatest cars because German manufacturing is just the best. I mean, hell, look at NASA. You think Americans are building that shit? Operation Paperclip, go check out that episode and those Soviet cosmonaut ones. On a side note, I am re-recording and updating those episodes, so catch them now while they still exist before I replace them. But I'm off on a weird tangent now, so I'm talking about American car culture and how it's so freaking out there and crazy. It's like the craziest car culture in the world. I mean, why do you think we have things like monster trucks and NASCAR? There's nothing practical about it. It's just fun. But I think that leads me into my next kind of thing. We are spoiled and we like to have fun. There's really nothing practical about the way we live our lives sometimes. Now, like myself, for example, I tend to live a somewhat budget-oriented, minimalist lifestyle, but I do like to have my fun, and here in America, we have enough leisure time where we can have that fun. Now, I know that sounds strange because Americans are generally considered to be like hardworking people who never have leisure time or never have vacations. And yes, our business culture is very weird and tyrannical and toxic, and we have these bosses and managers who will make us feel bad for requesting a day off for rest. But we do have an extreme amount of leisure time that a lot of non-Americans don't see. Because 9 times out of 10, the average work week for an American is only about 38 hours. Technically in America, 32 hours is considered full-time. We just have a tendency to work that extra shift because, hey, it's more money on the paycheck. And we like to spend that money, and we like to spend that money on stupid shit. And that's another American extremism, our rampant consumerism. Americans are the #1 consumer culture on the planet. There's a reason why the average American is always broke. It's not because we're spending our money on practical things, paycheck to paycheck. We buy a lot of stupid shit. We buy a lot of things that are absolutely unnecessary. I mean, how many people have like a life-size stuffed emperor penguin? I mean, I do, because I got it as a gift from my ex-wife. Is it practical? No. Was it possibly a dumb purchase? Totally. But at the end of the day, I like it. That's why I still have it. Because penguins are my favorite animal. Now I'm second guessing whether the mascot for this show should have been a penguin, but it doesn't really make sense when it comes to rabbit holes, so we'll stick with Death Bunny. I love rabbits. If I ever buy a ranch, I'm totally calling it Death Bunny Ranch, trademark pending, but I digress mostly because I'm drunk. I bet this whole show sounds like shit right now, and I could fix it in post, but I really don't want to. But it is true, we are a massive consumer culture. It's a stereotype, but at the same time, it is true. I don't know a single American who doesn't own a whole bunch of random shit that they just don't need. I mean, hell, I have this apartment right now, and I actually don't need it because I also own a mobile home on the other side of town. Now, for those who don't know, a mobile home is also known as a manufactured home or a trailer. Think Trailer Park Boys, but it's not as shitty. But having 2 homes, that's kind of an American idea, even though I'm considered working class. It stems from this, I guess, rampant consumerism that we all kind of chase here in the United States. Now, I'll be honest, my motivation for having this apartment was they were building it, I was getting divorced, and hey, it's awesome. It's considered luxury, and I got it. Plus, I thought it would make a great podcast studio, so I'm out $1,300 a month for it. Not practical in the least, and I'm actually gonna give up my lease in February and move back into my mobile home to save money. But it's another example of I only got it because we as Americans were rampant consumers. We always want what's new. And that's why things like malls were such a huge thing up until the early 2000s when the malls started becoming shuttered because of the rise of internet shopping. That's why Amazon is such a powerhouse in the world as a company. It's this thought of instant gratification without having to put a whole lot of work into it. And we as Americans, we crave that instant gratification. That's why we spend so much time on things like social media. That's why we excessively shop. That's why we're considered a consumerist nation. Of course, that's also why we shutter factories here in the United States and send that work overseas because we can get extremely cheap, almost slave labor to manufacture our goods, so we can keep buying more shit for super cheap. But once again, I digress. But hell, that idea of instant gratification is also why things like fast food restaurants are so prominent here in the United States. I mean, if I wanted a cheeseburger and I didn't feel like making it, I can go to McDonald's and have one in less than a minute. Now, unfortunately, that's gonna have the nutritional value of, I don't know, eating reconstituted cardboard, but it's kind of why Americans crave bigger food. Now, a lot of people will say that Americans don't have a food culture, but we have an insane food culture here. It's amazing what you can get. Hell, it's amazing what I can get here in Columbus. Or, you know, where I am in Lancaster, just about 30 minutes south of Columbus. Can I get fresh octopus here in the middle of Ohio? I can. But that's another thing. It's another cultural thing because America is made up of thousands of different cultures and we all kind of blend together, especially in the trade hubs. So, for example, I can get food from all over the world. I'm only 30 minutes from an international market. But we Americans traditionally, especially out here in the Midwest, we gravitate towards more, I guess, high calorie, fatty, salty foods. And we like a lot of it because the stereotype of Americans being gluttonous is a thing. It's true. We are severely gluttonous. I mean, look at all these food challenges that exist across our nation. Hell, if you go to Las Vegas, just look at the Heart Attack Grill. That is a real restaurant. It's like the burger mecca of the United States. It's the only restaurant in the United States where they will actively warn you that this food is hazardous to your health. Now, most people around the world will be like, that's insanely unhealthy. Why would anybody want to eat that? But to an American, that's like a challenge. And I think at the end of the day, it all comes back to that idea of being challenged. It's quintessential with the American spirit. The American spirit is, you're not going to tell me what to do, and if you tell me I can't do something, I'm going to prove you wrong and do it. For example, they told us we couldn't overthrow our overlords and seek out a new republic, and we did it. People around the world said you'll never defeat the Soviet Union or destroy communism, but we crushed it. They even say today you'll never beat China or the Soviet Union in a war. We would absolutely annihilate them. They told us, you guys can't become the biggest economic power in the world. 2 golden ages in 50 years. The golden age of the 1950s and the golden age of the 1990s. They told us that we would never survive a civil war, that a civil war would cause the nation to fly apart into several different factions. Well, we've already had one civil war, and the Union still exists. And they continue to tell the average American that we can't do this, we can't do that. We could do it if we wanted to, because we take everything as a challenge. Now, I will admit, we weren't able to win a ground war in Afghanistan because nobody has ever been able to win a ground war in Afghanistan. Those fuckers can fight. But we weren't afraid to step up to the challenge. And that's the key word behind all of this, challenge, because Americans love to be challenged. We are never complacent with what we have. We always want that next challenge, that next adventure. We want to succeed in that next goal. And we are tenacious. If we want it, we're going to go out and take it. Because as I said, who the fuck is anyone to tell us what to do? Because we don't bow before kings. We don't do things just because it's the proper thing to do in our social class. And to be perfectly honest and blunt, we don't care about anybody else's opinion but our own. We truly are the punk rock anarchists of nation states. However, we do ascribe to tradition. We do have traditions that are heavily American that don't really exist elsewhere. For example, we have this almost, worship of our military. But to be honest, that worship is ingrained in that early myth of our founding because we were founded by war. And since our military has always been mostly voluntary, we hold those members of our military up on a higher status because those guys have and are giving up certain freedoms that we Americans take for granted every day. And they're doing it in the patriotic interest of whatever oil company is seeking larger profits these days. I digress. But our military is truly the greatest and most technologically advanced military in the world. I mean, look at NATO. NATO would crumble without us. And I'll be honest, our military is mostly made up of like southern hillbillies and rednecks. Those guys are pretty hardcore. The only thing that really stifles us anymore is the fact that we don't have that sense of total war when we go into a new country or an area. We do this kind of restricted warfare where we're just taking out enemy combatants. But if we had a total war scenario like World War II was, where it's like, fuck them, annihilate them all, we would roll over any other nation state in a matter of days. Plus, it also helps us out that we're reversing alien tech at Area 51 to have the most elite hardcore air force in the world. Not very many 6th gen fighters coming out of Russia or West Taiwan, but I digress. But that all rolls back into our inherent patriotism. Like I said, patriotism is ingrained in us from day one. But it's a general general rule because when you come to America, you become an American, regardless of your background or ethnicity. Once you step foot on American soil and you decide you're going to live here and spend the rest of your life here and raise your children here, you become an American. And we are the only nation in the world where that is true. I can't go to China and become Chinese. I can't go to France and become French. However, if I were from China or France or Mexico or Russia or wherever, I can come to America and become American. We're the only nation in the world where that is possible. Because at the end of the day, America is a mindset. We do have some general customs and feelings and attitudes that most people tend to easily assimilate to. And I know this is true because I see this every day, even in my current line of work. For example, I work in finance, and part of the model that the company I work for engages in, we do a lot to help out immigrants, especially from places like in Ohio, mostly it's Mexico, Central America. We get a lot of immigrants from Africa, and we help provide them with some financial and banking services that they can't really get at a traditional bank or anywhere else. And I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen people who have only been in the United States for a few weeks who already start assimilating into our culture. And no matter what the fuck it says on their passport or their immigration status or even their complete lack of papers sometimes, at that point, they become an American, at least in my eyes, because they come here to try to get a little slice of that American dream. They want an easier life. They want to be able to work and provide for their families. And at the end of the day, after a hard day of work, they want to be left the fuck alone for a few hours so they can chill and just live their lives. And I can't think of anything more American than that. The American dream is still alive and well here in the United States. I mean, I look at myself as a story. I grew up white trash trailer park with two parents who dropped out of high school. And, this was the 90s, so this wasn't very long ago. And my dad, he went out, and still to this day, he goes out and works hard every day. He has one of the strongest work ethics I've ever seen in a human. And it's all to provide for his family. I don't think my father has ever done anything just for himself or his own enjoyment. But that hard work and that never say die attitude and that tenacity led him to the American dream. The dude has gained and lost everything multiple times. Fortunes, and it took me until I was a young adult in my 20s to really understand how hard he worked and how spoiled I was. But that eventually instilled into me a strong work ethic, and that instilled into me my own American dream, that idea that I can go out and have what I want, and if I lose it, then that's life. I've learned a valuable lesson. I can start over again, and that is true. Even in my own life, I have literally had everything a man could want in life, and I have lost it, only to start regaining it again. And I don't really dive into my personal story in this show, but I had it all at one point. I had a great wife who loved me for several years, hot blonde, huge tits, no ass, but I don't really care about that. And I'm drunk right now, so I don't care who hears this. I'm on Voodoo Ranger number 4. I digress. And she was actually from a more well-off family. And I remember during the first 2 years of our marriage, we were still living here in Lancaster in an apartment. And I had no desire to move out to her family's property. But they would always make the offer, hey, we got this extra house out here on the property. There's no mortgage on it. It's paid off. You can move into it. Just maintain the grounds. And you might want to do some remodeling. But if you want it, it's yours. So who wouldn't jump on that deal? And this was an awesome house. This was the house where I had my tiki bar while I was building my tiki bar. It was 15 rooms with a full 2-car garage. I even had my own workshop downstairs where I could work on guns and do all the stuff I needed to do while remodeling the house. There was this huge 12 by 12 foot party deck with a little deck off that. It was 6 by 6 and had a built-in fireplace with porch swings and a bench. It was friggin' awesome. I had total run of over 50 acres with a private pond, and I could fish for largemouth bass and bluegill. It was the American dream, and we were saving a fortune because we were both working and we were pouring that fortune back into the house, because when you live like that, there's a lot of maintenance costs, especially when you remodel a house. And since we were out in the middle of nowhere and I had this stereo system from the 70s with these kick-ass speakers that would literally rattle the windows of the house, I would throw these huge, raging, I called them my concert nights. I'd crank up Psycho Stick or 90s pop or baby metal or whatever I was in the mood for that night. Have some beers, have some wine, and just have a blast. That house is actually where the first 3 episodes of this show was recorded. I had the complete American dream and then some. However, my marriage did fall apart. However, that was due to some personal stuff. I found out I had this genetic blood clotting disorder called Factor V Leiden, which will eventually kill me one day. So I started living every day like it was my last in this party attitude and neglecting my marriage, and it caused my whole marriage to implode. And I just naturally assumed that she was going to get the house, so I went and bought a mobile home and then this apartment. We dissolved our marriage, and that was that. But I think what I'm getting at is the American dream. A lot of people say the American dream is dead, but it's nowhere near dead because I had the American dream. I had the American dream up until 2022. And I'm not rich. Like I said, I'm working class. I make $16 an hour in my job. I'm literally going to eat rice and beans and frozen pizza all this week because after bills, I is broke. However, I feel like the American dream is still alive. I still have those desires to not regain what I had. I had it. I enjoyed it. I don't miss it. It was awesome, but I have that feeling that I can have something better from that. And at 37, I'm starting all over again. But that's the thing with America. America is that land where you can start all over again. It's that promise of a new world, a new start. And if you're willing to learn and take advantage of your situation and figure out how to make it, you too can achieve your American dream, whatever it may be. Your American dream may be vastly different from mine. My dream was essentially to have a, hillbilly paradise out in the middle of the Hocking Hills with a tiki bar. But your American dream might just be something like having financial independence, being out of debt, maybe owning your own business. LLCs are really cheap to get, by the way. Or maybe you just want the traditional nuclear family with 2.5 kids in a small house in the suburbs somewhere. Because the American dream is very flexible and it's not dead. It's just whatever you want to achieve in life to say, yes, I made it, I succeeded. And fuck you to anyone who says otherwise. But I think the point I'm getting at is here in America, you have to have that tenacity. You have to put in a little bit of work. And to be honest, this show that I do, it's not my American dream. It's a hobby that I got into that was inspired by my ex-wife and I kind of goofing around about this subject matter. But in my later life, my personal American dream has shifted to something else. I don't really know what that is right now, but that's the fun of finding out in hindsight. But it is truly not something that's dead. It's still achievable if you work for it. Because at the end of the day, here in America, we're not just going to hand it to you. We're going to make you work for it because that's ingrained in our culture. That's why we are so anti-classism, anti-authoritarianism, because we believe that if you want a higher status in society, you have to work for it, or you have to manipulate millions of people in order to gain that. Nothing is handed out on a silver platter for free. And if you don't agree with that, then I don't know, I guess you're a fucking loser. But let's wrap this up. I am kind of rambling now, probably because I'm on my 5th Voodoo Ranger and this stuff's 9.5%. Americanism is a lot like punk rock. It can best be summed up in 2 words, and those 2 words are fuck you. I'm sure that those 2 words were the first thing that the founding fathers wanted to say to Parliament and the King of England. However, they had to class it up because it was the 1700s. But that general idea of fuck you permeates all the way to this day. And if you just keep that fuck you attitude in your heart, you will achieve the American dream. Even if your dream is to, be a crackhead living in a tunnel somewhere, you will achieve it with that fuck you attitude. But on that note, I am going to wrap this up. Once again, this is Mike. I thank you for listening. Feel free to follow it on the socials, Instagram, Facebook, whatever. I know this was a really different episode than what I normally do. I talked about a lot of personal stuff this time around, but it's my show. I can do whatever I want, and this is the 4th of July special. So, fuck you. Happy 4th of July, and I will see you in the next episode.